So hello and welcome to Top-Down Consulting's Kscope Encore series. We begin today with Juan and Brian Willson presenting data validation, what is the best approach. Juan and Brian will take questions at the end of the presentation, but you can ask them anytime during the presentation by using the question box on the right side of your screen. They'll read the questions and respond to them as they get them at the end. And with that, I will turn this over to Brian.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Shana, for that introduction. My name is Brian Willson, and thank you for attending our data validation, what is the best approach Encore series. So as I said, my name is Brian Willson. I am a solution director with TopDown. I've been working in the EPM space for over 10 years. Mainly in the consolidations area, so I have plenty of experience in data validation as it relates to consolidations, but just overall data validation. In a prior life, I spent quite a bit of time in industry and accounting, and at the same time experienced a lot of data validation on that side simply through either monthly closes or going through some EPM implementations from a client side. So thank you again for attending, and I'll turn it over to Juan.
Thank you, Brian. My name is Juan. I'm the Chief Solutions Officer and founder of TopDown Consulting. And like Brian as well, I've been working with the EPM solutions for many years. In fact, I'm just about 30 years now, whether on the vendor side, having managed the global deployment of these solutions on the client side as well, and then just over 16 years ago, founding TopDown Consulting. If you'd like some more information about who is TopDown or us, we welcome you to take a look at our website. And let's go ahead and move right into the presentation now. So in talking about data reconciliation or data validation, this is one area in particular that we find for a lot of projects or a lot of clients we work with as we begin the initial conversations, as we're going through sort of scoping and just determining exactly what needs to be done with their applications, that there is, if you will, sort of a let's hurry up and just kind of get through this. The client, people don't understand or maybe don't want to pay as much attention to the effort, the details necessary, or the time and effort it takes to actually perform data validation. And as a result, part of where we need to start then with this is really understanding where your data lives. Where is it coming from? So in doing that, we want to understand your systems. Is it ERP related data? Is it HR? Is it salary based? Maybe your data is coming from or lives in an existing EPM, or whether it's Oracle Hyperion or some other application. And with this, by taking a look at all of that, it gives us the ability to really understand kind of, one, the consistency of the data and where and how that's really kind of what the quality is of it. For many folks, if you think about it, when you look at the data itself and where you're doing reporting from, a lot of time that's coming directly out of an Excel spreadsheet. Maybe you're using SmartView or using some kind of a spreadsheet add-in in order to access that data, bring it into Excel, and generate your core financial reports. One of the problems we find, or one of the problems we see, though, is that in that 9th hour, as people are getting ready to basically generate their reports, if you will, or if you print them, there might need to be a final adjustment that's being made. And sometimes there are these values that are being added or subtracted to what's coming or what's in these spreadsheets. And so the data in the source system, if you will, may or may not be, as we say, as clean as we think it is. And in part because of where some of these adjustments might take place. So we need to look at all of this in its entirety. Another aspect of really, when we talk about sort of getting to know you a little bit, is along the lines of what are your requirements when it comes to data validation? What is your, as far as internal or external audit, for example? This can take you to a number of different ways that you might have to look at this. Everything from maybe a very simplistic requirement might be just to ensure that in total or at the fully consolidated level, everything is balanced, everything is reconciled, validated back to our sources or back to our actual reports that we presented in the past. We've seen it also go to an extreme level, if you will, or to a sort of the opposite end of the spectrum there, where for every legal entity, every line of business, full sets of financials had to be printed, they had to be reviewed, and had to be signed, physically hand-signed at the bottom of every report. Now, as you can probably guess, there's a big difference in maybe the level of time and effort that it takes to actually do and sort of satisfy these requirements, and this is where we need to make sure that we understand what that is up front, that you understand what's involved, that we can identify the proper resources and what those requirements are, know where your data is coming from, and then truly understand as part of this, then ultimately, what does your application look like? What is it? What are we trying to achieve with it? And how is the data going to be actually organized within that? We need to make sure we take into account whether it's things like rounding or different levels of precision that might exist that would affect the validation process. So taking a look at all of this and making sure that people understand where in your application, where the data actually lives and where it's going to live and how it's going to be presented and how it's going to be used, so that we can actually have a point with which we can validate from a financial reporting view back to what we have done from a historic or legacy standpoint.
Okay, thank you, Juan. So just to reiterate, now that we've kind of covered the overarching view of how to get started, let's talk about kind of almost a step-by-step view of how we pursue data validation, a lot of the recommendations that we've seen just over time. And so let's just start at the top by making a plan. So it's very important that you formulate a game plan. One of the things that we typically recommend as part of this process is you may have an overall project plan for your EPM implementation, or any implementation for that matter, but it's also important to maybe have a project plan specific to your data validation. That way you can create this project plan with particular individuals in mind, particular departments in mind, with the ability to break out the level of detail necessary to really get through this data validation efficiently and on time, in line with the goals of the project. Far too often what we see is, it's kind of the person that draws the short straw that they get stuck with the data validation, and then it's one person dealing with numerous legal entities having to validate the data, or hundreds and hundreds of entities trying to validate the data. It's better if you kind of have this game plan, this project plan, if you will, to start off with, so that going in what to expect, and you can really kind of plan out the duration that it's going to take. And the reason why we say that is you have to make it a priority. More often than not, like I said, a lot of times we see it being more of an afterthought, people not spending as much time on data validation as they would, as we would like them to, and as a result, it either gets rushed or it causes delays in the project. So it's always good to really establish a culture where the quality of your data is going to be a priority. And what we've seen far too often is either you're going to pay now or you're going to pay later, and we'd rather be proactive and set up a plan ahead of time so that it becomes a much smoother process. Understand that it's not a quick process. It is definitely something that is going to take a lot of time, and in your EPM project plan, as you're planning out these projects, make sure that you set aside enough time to cover the data validation. It's not simply just a one-week exercise. And many times we see it's many weeks, depending on the volume of entities that you're trying to validate. So make sure you set aside enough time to be able to cover that, understanding that it's not going to be a very quick process. And then just to touch a little bit on what Juan had spoken to earlier, in terms of your historical data, when you're in the midst of your project, you're doing your data validation, it's really important to understand what those true reporting requirements are. What are your internal reporting requirements, and what are your external reporting requirements? What can you get by with to go live on, and should you consider doing just enough to be able to go live and then going back and validating some later? But there are repercussions to either viewpoint there. So it's something that we'll talk about as we progress through our presentation, but it's something that you should think about up front, is really truly what are those reporting requirements, kind of what's the minimum amount of data that you can load, and then what is the impact if you load more later on.
So Brian, I think just as it relates to the historical data aspect, one thing that we find is that, you know, if people feel like they're getting squeezed from a time frame as far as going through their project, and they feel like, well, how can we accelerate this? They sometimes look at it and say, well, let's just focus on the current year, and then we'll work our way backwards. And, you know, from that standpoint, we tend to find that there's a, you know, without knowing sort of the details maybe of either the legacy, maybe calculations, if you will, or the new application, how those calculations are defined, things like currency translation, especially as it relates to, you know, where we have a US dollar override, or we need to lock in a historical rate and be able to pull from those opening balances, or looking at the balance sheet for retained earnings or other things like that. These become areas that are basically become gotchas. If there are calculations that changed on a historical basis, and maybe we had thought we could just put a stake in the sand and say, whatever the calculations are this year or based on last year, you know, that's fine. We don't have to worry about the, you know, differences, or we'll just use the same basis for the last 5 years. But if there were changes in those calculations partway through, then that creates a validation difference as well.
Yep, totally agree, Juan. Thank you very much for that. So now that we've decided to create a plan to start our data validation, the next thing that we want to do is really define what the requirements of the actual data validation are. So one of the most important things with any project, whether it's data validation or anything else, is the quality of your documentation. So obviously in this day and age, there's a lot of emphasis on audit. There's a lot of emphasis on SOX requirements. So it's important that you get with your audit teams, your internal auditors, your external auditors. It's important that you get with your SOX teams and understand really truly what are the documentation requirements for your project, specifically as they relate to data validation. Do you have any sort of internal requirements as well around that? Is there anything from a departmental perspective or a legal entity perspective that requires you to document something? So these are things that as you're starting your plan, as you're getting started with this process, it's important to really document those things, get a clear understanding of what those are so that they aren't gotchas later on down the line. And just in moving along with that, it's important that you put together milestones. So these are kind of checkpoints along the way just to help you and aid in tracking this process. We need to have X amount of legal entities validated by a certain amount of time. By setting these milestones, you're able to really track the progress of the project and understand if there's going to be any issues as you go through this data validation process, and if that's going to hold up anything else.
Brian, I know our focus seems to be a little bit heavy on the, if you will, audit side, from whether internal or external, but are there times where IT as well has requirements as it relates to data validation?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there are times when IT may have requirements in terms of how long they archive data or how often they back up data. So those are things that you have to think of along the way as well.
And would you think that data validation is not just as it relates to bringing over historical data for the audit, if you will, for audit purposes, but also as it relates to things like integration testing?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Okay. So we've talked about defining the requirements. The next step in this process is really around defining the process itself. Defining what the data validation is, what are the tools that we can use for the process, and those folks involved in this part of the data validation process. So, just like with anything else, you always have to have the right tool for the right job. And when doing data validation, I think it's no different. Our history tells us that in the projects that we've done in the past, regardless of the type of product, it's important to really focus on the proper tool for doing the project in order to get through this data validation process a little bit easier. One of the things that we find that really helps speed along the process when we're talking about the EPM space is leveraging FDMEE. This really allows you to see what your source records are, so where that data is coming from and where they're being loaded to. And it also gives you visibility into kind of how that historical data is mapped. So it's a lot of times it's not a one-to-one mapping between your historical data to your new applications. So FDMEE provides a really good link between those two through the canned reports in FDMEE and just the ability to illustrate the mapping very easily. You get to leverage that tool quite a bit. As part of the process, if it's something that's going to be part of your EPM implementation, obviously you start to get exposure to that product as well early on. So we find that FDMEE is definitely one of the more valuable tools as part of the data validation process. And then obviously Excel. Everybody in the finance space is very well acquainted with Excel. What we find is that it's a very effective tool in doing comparisons. It's much more effective than doing a manual tick and tie, if you will, between reports. The ability to pull in data through SmartView, possibly from a historical system into your new system. If we're talking about anything in the EPM space, there's some sort of Excel add-on for those applications. So it's the one central area where you can pull in both historical data from a different application and compare it to what's going into the new application and really help you from a validation perspective on being able to do those comparisons.
So even though I'm a rock star, Brian, with regards to using Excel and VLOOKUPs and everything else, and just doing some real quick modifications of a data file, you're suggesting that FDMEE would be the, if you will, the leading approach or leading practice for
absolutely. Data. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's again, it's within the EPM space. It's a consistent product across all of the projects, and it's a case where between the canned reports and the ability to visualize the mapping, you get a lot of value out of that. In fact, I've seen instances on certain projects where the reports coming out of FDMEE have been used for audit purposes to show the auditors, here's where the data came from, here's where it's going to, here's how we've been able to validate it accordingly. Okay, so we've talked about the tools that we're recommending for this data validation process. The next thing we want to talk about is who are the people that are going to be involved in this process, and hopefully everybody on the call is a Giants fan. Obviously, we're a San Francisco-based company. I did get a lot of flack for this in Chicago whenever we put this slide up originally. But let's talk about the starting lineup. So this is really the team members who are going to be using the applications the most. These are the folks that are going to be involved in the data validation efforts, and really, that really is more centralized around the business. The business has to take control of this process. In many cases, what you'll find is that the people that have the knowledge around the historical data aren't necessarily part of the process, and it does cause delays. So what we recommend is that the business takes control of this process, and really the developers are there to provide more of technical troubleshooting or technical support around calculations, maybe a little bit of support around mapping if there's logic behind some of the mapping. But overall, it's really important for the business to be the primary caretaker of this process, because they're the people that are going to be involved going forward on a day-to-day basis with dealing with these applications.
And I think just as an added point to this and added benefits is that as people are going through this and participating in this validation process, there is an inherent development knowledge that's being created about the application, about where the data is, how to actually navigate through the solution, which further extends itself out to the rest of the community or rest of the constituents that you would have that are using this solution, so that they can further get an increase in benefit or immediate benefit as the application then goes live.
Perfect. So we've talked about our plan. We've come up with a plan. We've talked about the people that are going to be involved in this process, part of this plan. Now we want to talk about some of the things that we can take on in the beginning that are really going to prevent us from having issues going forward. These are some really low-hanging fruit, things that we need to think about before we start the data validation process, that if we skip over these things or if we gloss over these things, they could come back to bite us later on in the process. So as part of a pre-check, if you will, you want to make sure that your data set is complete before you ever start. So that's not just the data that you're bringing over, the financial data that you're bringing over from your application. You want to make sure that your translation rates are also loaded as part of this process. Far too often, we'll see people get be in a rush to get the historical data over there and forget about the translation rates. And as soon as they start the validation process, they start to realize, hey, there's something really wrong here. And they may chase their tails looking at mapping or other things before it dawns on them that these translation rates haven't been loaded. So a very simple thing to overlook, but extremely important to remember. Make sure those translation rates are loaded. In accordance with that, if you have any sort of ownership percentages, any type of special ownership that is being built into the application, make sure that those ownership percentages are being loaded. That's definitely going to help you if you have any sort of subsidiary investment in subsidiaries, those types of things that the ownership percentages really rely on. And then the other thing that we see quite often is sometimes people forget to load their historical dollar overrides. So in a case where maybe you've got you need to keep a capital infusion at a consistent rate or a consistent dollar amount, if you forget to load that as you start to aggregate the data and check it, you're definitely going to be off there. So we always recommend people these are kind of three main topics that you should be looking at as you start this process, is make sure, hey, I have my rates loaded, got my ownership percentages loaded, and any sort of dollar overrides are also in the system. Okay, so now that we've got our pre-check done, it's almost like a trip. We've got our pre-check done. Now we're really ready to start getting into the meat of the matter in terms of this data validation process. So the three things that we really want to focus on is looking at our non-calculated base members. So we want to keep it simple in the beginning. Let's just make sure that we don't have to worry so much about calculations. We don't have to worry so much about translations just yet. Let's make sure that as we load this data, we're validating the data at the lowest level base members. By doing this, we're validating our mapping. As long as we get our journals loaded, we're validating the journals. So we haven't even started thinking about calculations just yet. We're really just focusing on those base members. We're not even worried about hierarchies at this point. We're really just focusing on getting the lowest level of data from your historical application to this new application and starting there first. So that way, if we've got a good solid foundation, all that data ties, the rest of it should flow up accordingly just based on calculations.
I think the base members in particular, Brian, if I look at that, is one area that we find to be very successful, or one approach we find very successful is to look at your chart of accounts and to break it up into different sections. Again, understanding where the data is actually coming from. If I'm focused on, if I have data coming from an ERP system, for example, that basically completes or is intended to generate my trial balance, I want to make sure I isolate that first and focus on that before I start dealing with any supplemental data, statisticals, or any other ways that we might present, for example, a gap version of the income statement or balance sheet. Kind of address it there in that local currency, and then be able to extend it beyond that so that we can isolate, check things off as we go forward then.
I totally agree. I think the trial balance approach definitely has its advantages and really helps get things started. So now that we've talked about our base members, this trial balance view, if you will, now let's kind of move it on up. Let's start to roll up these non-translated members. Let's start to roll them into parent members. Let's validate the hierarchies. So if we've validated our base members, we've got a good solid foundation. Now we're validating our non-translated parent members. So we're really just truly validating the aggregation. We're validating the hierarchies to make sure that the way that we've constructed the hierarchies in the new application matches up to the historical data that we're pulling from. So now we're just simply checking on a non-translated basis at a local currency level, is this data now aggregating as we expect it to? So we've taken the step of building the foundation. Now we've kind of laid that next level on it, that secondary level, if you will, of just making sure that everything aggregates properly. And it seems fundamental, but you'll be surprised at how many people just go straight to the top and try to validate from the very top the house with all the translations, all the calculations applied there, and then get frustrated when it doesn't tie on the first try. So this is a much more proven solution. This is something that we do all the time as part of our data validation processes. So definitely it's recommended that you kind of follow these steps and move your way up the chain so that at the end of the day you're saving yourself a lot of headache on the backside. Okay, so we've moved it on up. We'll keep it moving, if you will. And really what we want to do is talk about the logical aspects of the application now. So we've verified our data load, we've verified the mapping through FDMEE, we've verified the hierarchies. So now we're transitioning into the moving parts, if you will, the logic-driven values, the roll forwards, those things that are calculated. So now we're starting to validate our beginning balance roll forward. So we're starting to validate the foreign currency translations, any sort of calculated accounts that rely on the fundamental parts of the data to be correct. We start to validate our eliminations. So this is really where we start to get into the challenges. But you can see how it's extremely important that we took those previous two steps before we get to this. If our base isn't good, everything after that is not going to be good either. So we really want to take the time now to focus on the roll forwards. We want to focus on the translations, pay attention to those calculations. And this is really where the developers start to play a little bit larger role in the validation process, because they're providing this knowledge transfer to the business as to how these components work. So we're at that step where we're kind of starting to peak a little bit in terms of our ability to validate the data.
I think this really kind of lends itself, because it's not that this is purely a step by step as to kind of a sequence or a process, but there is the elements that you have to look at when you look at things in a local currency. For example, we talked about starting with the trial balance and then looking at your calculations, looking at ratios, supplemental data, other things that come into play. Again, the focus is because in many of the applications and many of the clients we work with, there are certain calculations that will occur only at the base level or at the level 0 in local currency, and then other calculations that will take place once maybe at a post-translated or post-allocated, or maybe even the allocations themselves or post-eliminated basis that need to be evaluated separately or validated separately. So understanding, again, what's your application is actually doing, when is it making changes, if you will, or affecting the data, and then where that validation needs to come into play.
Yep, all fantastic points, Juan. Thank you very much for that. So again, we've started with our foundation. We've built it up through our hierarchies. Now we've done our calculations. At that point, we should feel that we're very confident with the integrity of the data, the quality of the data. Now what we want to do is really lock that data so that we prevent any changes from the historical data. We're kind of at that point in the process where we don't want to change anything. We feel very comfortable with the integrity of the data. So now we have the discussion of, well, do we lock at just the base members, or do we also include the parent members? And again, some of this is going to be directly driven by your internal audit requirements, your external audit requirements, maybe your SOX requirements. But what we've seen in the past is if you can get away with locking the base members, most often that should be sufficient. If you have shared members amongst multiple parents, sometimes if you also try to lock the parent members, it can be a bit of a hassle to unlock those in the rare instances that you may need to go back and reload historical data or make changes. So it does cause some tricky problems potentially if you lock the parent members. But again, that's going to be driven by really what your requirements are within each individual company. So you know, definitely going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, this is something that as you get through this process, you want to have a clear understanding of what those requirements are so that you can stay in lockstep with that. So again, regardless of whether it's a base or a parent, at this point, if we validated not only our base level data but our calculated data, and we feel that it's all tying like it's supposed to, we want to get to the point where we're locking that data up, maybe even taking an extract of it so that you know, you're saving yourself the trouble of having to reload that, from the start, in the event that maybe you need to reload some data.
And with this, Brian, as well, I would add that when we talk about locking the data, there's more than one way, more than one option, if you will, to facilitate that, to make that happen. It's not just purely a lock or unlock status, if you will. There could be other options where you may want end users not to be able to modify or change the data historically, but the administrator needs to be able to reconsolidate or recalculate, maybe based upon certain changes depending on the nature of the application and the purpose of the application that we're working with. So look at it in different ways, understand what those business requirements are, and then structure this element of it as it relates to the historical data in a manner that actually is going to meet and satisfy those requirements going forward.
Right. So hopefully you can see at this point, through this discussion, I mean, it's not simply an exercise of load the data, tick and tie it, make sure it ties. I mean, there's so many other things that you have to think about, so many other components in this process. That's why we stress that it's a very vital part of your projects, a very vital part of your implementations is really taking into account all the steps necessary to be successful as part of this data validation. So now that we've locked the data up, I jumped the gun a little bit and talked about extracting data, but really what we want to do is, in addition to locking it up, we want to back it up. We want to make sure that whether it's a database backup, whether it's a flat file extract, we have some sort of backup of that process or of that data, so that we don't have any issues if forbid that there's some sort of issue on the project. You want to make sure that you can recover that very quickly, so you don't have to go through this entire process all over again. So it sounds very simple. Again, it's going to be dependent on what your internal requirements are, even some of what your external requirements are. We have some clients that the backup process is an extremely vital part of their reporting requirements because of the sensitive nature of the data. So it definitely depends on the type of data that you're validating, but nonetheless, in either case, you want to make sure that you back it up according to whatever those internal rules or regulations are, so that we don't have to recreate this data if we don't have to. Okay, and then lastly, as part of this process, what we want to look at is we've come up with this project plan, we've stepped through all these different steps. We want to make sure that once it's completely validated, that the data is signed off on. It sounds like a simple thing, but as we go through this process, the fact that you can sign off on the data and you can formally document the completion of the process is a big deal. It shows progress within the project itself, but it also is completing a milestone within the project. So it's important that you've loaded the data, you've validated it on various levels, you've locked it, whether it's through a true locking process or through some sort of mechanism of security, you've backed up the data, so we've completed this process. So we really want to have a formal sign-off of this process so that we can just really verify the completion of it. So we've talked about kind of the steps in doing this data validation process, and it's been a pretty straightforward discussion in terms of the various steps that you have to take, some of the gotchas along the way, but we want to talk about maybe some other things that you don't necessarily think about in the beginning when it comes to data validation. You want to think about, is this a repeatable process? Because you may have to restate history often. So sometimes we see clients that are in a very high M&A activity type realm, and more often than not, they're restating history for M&A activity. They're having all sort of hierarchy changes that require them to maybe change the way that their historical data looks. So as part of that, you start to question what are the things that need to be thought about in terms of the historical data versus the data that's kind of forward-looking. Can you load just static data and not worry about the calculations? Can you bypass those calculations, or do you have to recalculate everything for historical data? So those are some of the things that we just want to talk about in terms of the ability to make changes to historical data if necessary, and really how that impacts kind of your data validation process. You have anything to add on that, Juan? Just some things to think about there?
Well, I think as we look, to the future, if you will, that's our next slide is, that this entire process, as you say, sets the stage for what we do going forward. And what we should be looking at is, as part of this validation phase or component of our project, what do we need to do on a regular, monthly, quarterly, annual basis as we continue to move forward? Are there differences in the level of validation or the need for the validation between actuals, between plan, forecast, or the data that's coming in to support those various cycles? And being able to make sure that we establish what those are as we go through this exercise, because it's not just a question, as you say, of ticking and tying data. This is an actual process, and it needs to be repeatable. It needs to be something that can be taught. It's a way that we can then, if we take advantage of it, that we can enhance the knowledge of our users and those that are directly going to be consumers of this data, because now they're actually seeing it, they're understanding what's behind it and where the data actually comes from.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. Some final thoughts for me is just, as you go through this process, it's not only just the validation of the historical data, like Juan talked about. It's if you're in the middle of an implementation, it can also be a process that you use as you do your parallels. It is a process that you can use if you, like I said earlier, if you're in an industry where you have a lot of M&A activity. So it's things that you just need to consider. Some of the things that we talked about in terms of, what are the triggers that cause you to fail? What are the triggers that cause this process to be longer than you expect? So please don't underestimate those things. Please take into account the steps that we talked about, so that you save yourself a lot of anguish on the back end by kind of taking this methodical approach to this process. So with that, if we don't have anything else, let me see if we have any questions. So it looks right now there are no questions. Does anybody have any questions that we could answer at the time?
Well, Brian, I think one question that we hear quite a bit, if you will, is what are some of those, if you will, lessons learned? What are some of those gotchas sometimes that just, people need to be aware of and sometimes get overlooked? They said, from a standpoint of if they're going through this, they may not be aware of who, whether it's who in the organization needs to be involved or other things like that.
Well, I know that lately one of the things that we've seen change quite a bit, I would say, in the last year or two, are really the external requirements. The requirements from your auditors, the requirements even sometimes from the board in terms of documentation. So that's something that I can't stress enough. It's something that if you can document these steps, if you can document these processes, if you can show a sign-off of the completion of these processes, it's something that is just becoming more and more of a requirement in all the industries that we've seen. It's just these external requirements from auditors or internal audit requirements or SOX requirements that are really driving a lot of this activity now.
And one other question I think, if I recall, that we were asked while we were in Chicago there was, if you're moving from, let's say, from HFM to planning or S-based or vice versa, do you really need to spend, and develop sort of this validation process, or to spend this much time in it? And, from my perspective in looking at these applications, I would say yes, you still do. And the reason being is that it's not just so much around sort of the level zero, the base data as to where maybe something is being input. For example, if we're going to take from HFM actuals and bring that over to Hyperion Planning to support an annual plan or a monthly forecast process, there still needs to be an established validation cycle or process that takes place there. And there is historical data that's going to be needed. I think part of what people have to kind of look at as it relates to that validation, as it relates to the overall cycle, is do we need to recalculate? Do we embed the same calculations or comparable calculations in our plan as it relates to the actuals that we have in HFM? And if so, can those calculations kind of exist or operate exactly the same way? We know that there's a difference in, if you will, the syntax or the VB script for HFM versus the a calculation S-based calculation definitions for planning or S-based. And what we found is that there does need to be sort of this look at, from a validation, how those calculations are performing, where they're performing, and then just the usage of that, because it will affect ultimately sort of the final reconciliation between the two applications.
Yep. No, I totally agree, Juan. I don't think it matters if you're within the same EPM space or you're coming from something completely different into EPM or vice versa. You can't afford not to pay more attention to data validation than most people do, simply to accomplish all of the things that we talked about, simply to save yourself some anguish as you transition between applications. So I don't think it can be stressed enough. So with that, if we don't have any other questions, I would ask that if you do have any additional questions that you think of maybe after the session, please feel free to email us with any questions that you may have, and we'll be glad to answer those. And if there's nothing else, I will say thank you very much and bid you guys adieu.